And finally, one last issue that I want to talk about that I think has pretty serious anti-competitive implications. You know, I started with these remarks talking about the competition that we're seeing in the areas directly regulated by the FCC, the mobile wireless space and telecommunications more generally. But increasingly, all of that competition is winnowing down to a single choke point, and it's Apple. Apple, with their control over the operating system, software, coupled with their control over hardware, is creating a walled garden that is having very anti-competitive impacts on the telecom space and adjacent spaces more generally. It's an area where I know the Department of Justice and competition authorities are looking, but I also think it's an area where the FCC has a role to play as well. One feature of that walled garden that Apple has is something that people shorthand refer to as blue message, green message. And what happens there is when you are on an iPhone, they are necessarily degrading the text messaging service, whether it's sharing of photos between iMessage and an Android user, the photo quality is degraded. Whether it's physically looking at the green bubbles that show up when you're communicating, it has actually a low contrast. It makes it difficult for people with low vision or difficulty with seeing from picking up those messages. Again, that's sort of one feature of the broader problems that's happening with this walled garden approach. But I think this also highlights a role for the FCC. How many of you here are familiar with the issue of Beeper Mini? Raise your hands, Beeper Mini. That's it? One? A couple? Okay. So quick primer. Beeper Mini was a technology that was rolled out in December of last year that came up with a solution to the blue bubble, green bubble, walled garden. It enabled people on Android devices, whether Google or Samsung phones, to communicate directly with iMessage users in a blue bubble fashion, meaning there wasn't low contrast, there wasn't a degrading of photos or a degrading of video. In that way, among other things, in my view, it promoted accessibility and usability by people with disabilities, including having the ability to introduce more competition, which is good for everybody. And this is where there's a role for the FCC. I think the FCC should investigate Apple's conduct with respect to Beeper Mini. Subsequently, Apple made changes to iMessage to disable the functionality of Beeper Mini. And I think the FCC should investigate Apple's conduct there to see if it complies with the FCC's Part 14 rules. The FCC's Part 14 rules, in particular 47 CFR 14.20 and 14.21, flow from a landmark disability rights statute called the CVAA, the Communications and Video Accessibility Act. And those provisions talk about accessibility and how there's a provision in there expressly that says covered providers, which includes Apple's electronic messaging service, shall not install network features, functions, or capabilities that impede accessibility and usability. And so I think the FCC should launch an investigation to look at whether Apple's decision to degrade the Beeper Mini functionality that was being provided, which again encouraged accessibility and usability, was a step that violated the FCC's rules in Part 14. Rules that when the FCC adopted them, they analogized to Section 251, which is our core provision on interconnection. And I think this is one, again, sort of small example of the broader negative consequences that come from Apple maintaining and perpetuating a walled garden approach to technology. But we're not just seeing it here. There's a potential to see it in the future as well, whether it's with AI as those technologies continue to roll out, or AR or VR. I think there are potentially negative consequences if Apple perpetuates a world in which it treats its own proprietary technologies one way and degrades the performance of competitive ones. So again, I think some of the broader competitive effects here are one that the DOJ should look at, that the FTC should look at, including potentially structural remedies. But there's a role for the FCC as well, whether, again, it's looking broadly at the negative impacts that come from Apple being a choke point that can impact competition in our space. But again, more specifically here, it's looking at our Part 14 rules and whether Apple's conduct with beeper MIDI ultimately violated our rules. So with that, I'm going to end here and hopefully try to get you guys back on schedule a little bit. But again, I think there's more that we need to do to continue to encourage robust competition at the ISP level. But at the main, the biggest threat to openness and to competition in the internet ecosystem right now is not taking place at the ISP level, it's taking place at the edge. And I think this is an important conference to bring different people together to talk and look at these issues. So thank you so much for having me.
The death of Beeper Mini practically killed the dream of iMessage for working on Android, and now an FCC commissioner is calling for investigation into Apple's action in pulling the plug. Beeper Mini used a reverse-engineered method of accessing iMessage to give Android users the ability to send blue bubble messages from the Android devices, including using the phone number on the devices. At launch, it could work even without an Apple ID. But despite Beeper's confidence that Apple could not kill the system, Apple just did that a few days after launch. After weeks of back and forth, Beeper threw into trouble with one last bridge, which has since been disabled as Apple started banning customers' Macs for using Beeper. It's a very crazy story. In mid-December, a bipartisan letter called on the US Department of Justice to investigate whether or not Apple has broken antitrust laws in shutting down Beeper Mini. Now, FCC Commissioner Brendan is calling on the FCC to investigate the matter. Carr spoke on the matter during the State of Net conference with a clip of the request posted to X. Carr specifically focuses on whether or not Apple violated Part 14 of FCC rules. As per The Verge, that section lays out requirement for any advanced communication services. Specifically, it refers to the requirement for access to advanced communication services and equipment by people with disabilities. I really hope some investigation come out, and if it's proven Apple did monopoly, their monopoly over iMessage should be stopped permanently.